are again. We're the Around the Americas crew, and we are filming here with Todd Woodard from the Samish. What's your full title?
My full title is Infrastructure and Resources Executive Director, which is a really long-winded way. I oversee the Natural Resources Department, the Planning Department, and our Enforcement and Emergency Preparedness departments for the tribe. So I came up through the DNR department. I've been with the tribe for 17 years.
Wow.
Started out as a field tech, so DNR is where my heart lies, because I've helped build that department for 17 years. So
yeah, you kind of sparkle too when you talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely. I mean, I love the other departments as much. It's a really great challenge, but my knowledge base comes from the house that watches over all the territory, which is Lentikswa Chichitonquin Atlan, which is the name that's been given to our department. So yeah, it's that's who I'm representing today.
Today I'm here with Todd Woodard. We are the Around the Americas research expedition. We're going to be conducting a pole-to-pole kelp study around North and South America. And Todd, would you like to share a bit about yourself and your role within the Samish tribe?
Sure. My name is Todd Woodard. I'm the Executive Director for Infrastructure and Resources for the Samish Indian Nation, which means I oversee, one of the departments I oversee is the Natural Resources Department. And so we've been involved heavily in doing kelp research and restoration on behalf of the Samish people here in the San Juans, and thought that the setting here with Kukwalawoot and the foundational story that features kelp would be a good place to have our conversation.
Would you like to share a bit about the history of Kukwalawoot?
Sure. I am not the appropriate person to tell this story in its entirety. There are many Samish people who are far more eloquent than I am, but the storyboards that are around this pole, if you're ever in this area, really do tell the story. Kukwalawoot lived in a village that was located in this area, and as she was out harvesting shellfish, a clam kept hopping deeper and deeper, and she kept following it until all of a sudden she saw a face in the water, and she got quite scared. But then the face had a very calming influence and ended up being a being that lived under the sea, who came out and said he'd been watching her and found her extremely beautiful and would like to get to know her. And over time they fell in love. So Kukwalawoot brought him back to the village to have him ask for her hand in marriage. Her father said no, because there's no way that my daughter can go live under the sea with you folks. And that made the sea being a little bit upset, so he said, I will take away all of the resources that your people need. So the salmon disappeared, the shellfish disappeared, the crab disappeared, and it was a time of great hardship for the Samish people. And so Kukwalawoot went to her father and said, look, I love this guy, we would be happy together. With his powers I can live under the sea. And her father relented, but said, you must come back every year to the village so we know you're okay. So as you traverse around to the other side of this story pole, what you're looking at here is Kukwalawoot in her human form. But as you traverse over to the other side, as time went on, her hair began to turn into kelp. And she began to be encrusted with barnacles and things of that nature. She became much more of a creature of the sea. And so it was obvious that she became much more uncomfortable living on the land. And so her father said, look, we know you're happy, we know you're doing well, you no longer need to come back. And she said, okay, but just know that whenever you see kelp out in the water, that's me keeping an eye on my Samish people and protecting them. And that's really relevant here near the waters of Deception Pass because of the treacherous nature that can happen during high currents here. So I know whenever I'm out in my kayak playing in the pass and I see kelp, it adds a little bit of boost of confidence and knowledge that there's an ancestral being keeping an eye out on me.
How has the cultural significance of kelp contributed to your kelp restoration efforts?
Yeah, so Samish DNR, really the linchpin of all of our work is how does it link to perpetuating Samish traditions and Samish culture. So it's very difficult, I've learned, to separate personal cultural identity with the natural world. It's hard to break that apart here in Coast Salish country, and especially with Samish. And so, for instance, kelp, not only were the fronds used to wrap salmon to cook it in a traditional manner, but the bulbs were used to traditionally would hold eulachon oil, which is candlefish oil for light and small heat lamps. And the bulbs would also be dried with small stones in it, and those would become children's first rattles before they could carve their own out of cedar. So you could actually make an argument that kelp was an introduction to culture and song and tradition and ceremony for young people coming up in the tribe. And so it's not only a first food, it's just a very very cultural keystone habitat. And so when we started hearing that elders were having trouble finding kelp fronds to wrap their salmon and cook, that raises alarm bells and like, okay, what's going on and how can we help? So our work started using digitizing aerial photography. So literally every year we get new aerial photos, and a couple of people spend hours going cross-eyed in front of a computer with GIS, hand digitizing kelp around every island. The first time we did that, we were comparing 2006 data to 2016 data, and we found almost a 30% loss San Juan archipelago wide of kelp canopy coverage. So that really started raising alarms. One of the things we did as we did those aerial photography comparisons between 06 and 16, we sent a poster-sized chart home with one of our employees at the time who was a Samish citizen. And he interviewed his dad and his uncle, who between the two of them had 100 years of fishing experience in the San Juans, as commercial salmon fishermen. Modern day techniques with, with boats and stuff, but they knew these waters. And then to hear this gentleman tell the story for the next 3 hours, he handed them both markers and a map and said, "Where do you remember kelp?" And then sat down. And for the next 3 hours, he said, I listened to my dad and my uncle argue over the extent of kelp throughout the San Juan. Like, no, we used to foul our props there all the time. It was much bigger than that. Wow. And what we came back with, and you'll see this on the story map around kelp, is a hand-drawn map of where they remembered kelp. And we digitized that, and now we can lay it over our aerial photography. Now, I can't use it to give you an acre-to-acre comparison, but what's super easy to do is, wow, look at this bay. They remembered this being choked with kelp, and now there is none. What happened? Why? What's changed? Right? And so that's what I mean about folding indigenous scientific knowledge into modern day Excel-based data knowledge, right? Because it tells more of the story.
Yeah.
So, in fact, the floating kelp indicator for the partnership here, that indigenous information actually swung the needle in the San Juans from stable to area of concern. Because of that, that's the first time I'm aware, at least here in Washington, that indigenous data was, again, successfully married.
They didn't have a baseline.
Right, but it was successfully married with more modern technique data.
Wow.
And so now there's a whole kelp recovery plan that's run by the state. It's linked to rockfish, endangered rockfish recovery as well. There's a new floating kelp canopy indicator that I was part of the team that formed for the Puget Sound Partnership for their action agenda and how they measure the success of Puget Sound restoration. And so kelp is really becoming a real forefront in both research and restoration. So once we started doing aerial photography, we decided, hey, we should have a dive team. And I naively thought that would just mean getting people open water certified and we'd be out doing research. Was politely informed that scientific diving is a little more involved, but we had already started, so we kept going. So Samish now has a team of 4 AAUS certified scientific divers. We partner with Reefcheck, doing surveys throughout the San Juans. We're also partnering with Puget Sound Restoration Fund, and we're doing test outplantings for kelp restoration sites starting this summer. Last summer we identified some sites. This summer we're actually going to be doing outplants from kelp grown in a lab. So we've tried to move from data, turned it into information, and now we're entering an action phase.
Right.
And that's really what it's all about.
What have you noticed that's affecting the kelp most here in the Pacific Northwest and in the Samish water specifically?
Yeah, everyone asks that question,
yes.
And there is no one smoking gun.
Right.
We certainly think that the warm water blob, incident had a big effect on kelp. We're starting to see some recovery on some beds. Some beds, though, are not recovering, and we're not 100% sure why. So we think heat is definitely something that's exasperating things. We know the waters are getting more acidic, and that could be, but we're still out on the cutting edge of the research on that. The other thing is that there's a theory that once, kelp beds can recover on their own from these kind of events unless they get below a certain density. Then there's too much water flow. The gameta, the right parts don't find each other drifting in the water, and then they don't settle out locally in order to reproduce. And so we think it's a whole host of factors. And so what we've moved into is, let's monitor beds that are healthy to try and to determine why they're healthy, and also look for areas where through our aerial photography work, we know there was kelp. We've been looking to see, is the substrate still suitable? Let's try and do some outplanting and see if we can help that recover in that area.
Yeah, that's incredible. What specifically are you guys tracking as far as kelp beds go? How many kelp beds are around here? And
oh, there's I can't tell you how many acres of kelp beds there are. It's vast, but most of our kelp beds are what are known as fringing beds. So they're pretty narrow. They're right along sort of the cliff faces and stuff in the islands out here. We don't have sort of the giant beds that you can see from space like California has.
Okay.
So it's very different here. And that's why we have to use aerial photography mapping instead of satellite mapping, because our beds just, you can't pick it out because it's so narrow against the shore from satellite imagery right now. That technology is always changing too though, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you're involved with the Kelp Node. So why is collaboration and partnership so important when looking at kelp beds to get a whole better understanding of it?
Yeah, so the Kelp Node is part of the Biodiversity Action Network, which is actually formed under the UN Decade of Ocean Declaration, Ocean Decade Declaration. And so I've been part of the BioActNet steering committee on the US side since its inception, and the Kelp Node is the first sort of really active subgroup within BioActNet. And there's a lot of great research going on in the northern part of the Salish Sea, and Samish, we have citizens and relatives that are on the other side of the border. So Coast Salish people tend to ignore that funny black line in the water and think Salish Sea-wide. And so coordinating across the entire Salish Sea just allows us to share information, share techniques. For instance, Reefcheck is moving across the border now as sort of the standard for surveying. We've got lots of First Nations participation, and they're doing research. So it's just a really great way to bring that knowledge together, and also with Indigenous perspective, to bring that Indigenous scientific knowledge together. So by Indigenous scientific knowledge, I prefer that term to traditional ecological knowledge. For me, TEK is sort of this great umbrella term that covers like your 5th generation Skagit County farmer or your 6th generation fisherman from an area, right? If you then want to know about information from the first stewards of an area, now you're talking about Indigenous knowledge. And since all that knowledge is based on the same powers of observation that modern day ecologists use, let's just call it Indigenous scientific knowledge. It's now on the same playing field, and we can work to merge that information together.
Absolutely.
And tell a better story.
Yeah, that's very important. It's incredible that you guys are doing that.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun work. I will say it was a real sort of proud dad moment the first time I watched divers step off our boat, and then I spent 2 hours going, what are they doing? I want to know what they're doing down there. So there was the idea that I would toy with getting my certification, but unfortunately in my position, I spend much more time behind a desk than I do out in the field nowadays.
Yeah.
So I get to live vicariously through them.
That's awesome. So how long has the dive team been a part of this whole restoration?
We're on our 3rd summer now of having scientific divers, and we're actually positioning ourselves to be the very first Indigenous community that applies for membership as its own entity to AAUS. We're going through the application process, so we might be the first tribe to have that status.
Amazing.
So we're committed to doing this work. We recognized pretty quick that while we do have a lot of scientific divers associated with the universities at Shannon Point and Friday Harbor, they come and go every couple of years, right? So we felt that there was a real need to have a more permanent scientific dive community here. And it's really working out well. In addition to kelp, we're working on pinto abalone restoration with WDF&W. So we have several outplanting sites, which incidentally are named in the Strait Salish Samish language as their official names. And then the English name is parentheses afterwards. So we're pretty proud that the state agency was willing to do that. And it's becoming a great partnership. And of course, pinto abalone is strongly associated with kelp habitat as well. So,
yeah. So is there any other marine life that you've noticed that really impacts kelp growth? And is that involved in your restoration practice at all?
Yeah, so we definitely are seeing, we don't see the urchin barrens that most folks will find if they go Google it, in California and stuff, because we didn't have sea otters in the inland sea. They were mostly out on the coast. And so here in the inland sea, it was the big sunflower stars, Pycnopodia, that are sort of the top-down predator for urchins. They were really devastated by the starfish wasting disease, and they have not recovered like some of the other species are recovering. And so we are seeing urchins, but not full out barrens. We also see an increase in kelp crabs where there's no Pycnopodia. So there's actually a lot of work being done on trying to, can we grow Pycnopodia in a land and transplant them? The problem is, for a starfish, Pycnopodia move lightning fast. So trying to study them, you go down and dive, and the next day they could be thousands of meters away, which is really unusual for a starfish. So they're really hard to figure out, how do we keep them in one place to grow them and then put them out. So, but lots of interesting work going on out at Friday Harbor Labs with UW on that.
That's incredible. So there's a lot of work with the North and the First Nations up north. Are you interacting with tribes in the South, in South America at all, or around the globe, or is it mostly just the interactions with the Northwest? Yeah,
so my work has been pretty much focused here in the Northwest in the Salish Sea. Now that said, there was recently a conference, and there were 3 or 4 researchers from South America that were in attendance, and so there is definitely interest, and there's more going on, Americas wide as far as networking and learning.
Okay, so is there any other environmental stewardship that you guys are involved in that you want to talk about?
Oh gosh, we probably don't have time, but yeah, I mean, Samish DNR, one of the things that's great is we can so easily make these ties to a particular natural resources to the culture that it's a huge broad. In some aspects, it's a really huge lift to try and protect all culturally relative species and their habitats for future generations, right, which is DNR's mission our DNR's mission statement. So, but we have a lot of variety. We're particularly proud of our work in prairie bald and Gary oak restoration work because of camas and how those camas fields for that first food were managed by families with fire in the past. And so we're particularly excited about bringing those traditional practices back to the landscape. We do a lot of work on water quality issues. We've done a lot of beach restoration for forage fish spawning. We've done a lot of stream restoration for salmon. It's pretty broad. It's pretty broad.
That's awesome.
And then I think one of our other hallmark projects is over the last 10 years, we've removed more than 2 million pounds of creosote and other marine debris from the beaches throughout the San Juan archipelago. So that's a partnership project that we have with Samish providing the boat operations and our landing craft, and State Department of Natural Resources providing a WCC crew and the disposal costs. And that's been a decade-long now partnership that's making a huge impact. We're just not quite working ourselves out of a job quite yet, but we're trying. We're trying real hard on that one.
Yeah. So. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing and that the tribe is involved in. It's very, very inspiring and awesome to see that you guys are really taking this in your hands and doing what you can.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I also suspect that as you meet communities and indigenous communities on your travels, you're going to see we're not alone in these efforts. So I guess my big caveat too is I'm indigenous to Northern England and Sweden. Right. So I come by way of the Mayflower to the Mass Bay Colony and by Sweden to Chicago. So when I'm asked to give sort of an indigenous perspective, I usually say I can't. But what I can do is I can share what Samish people and other indigenous folks have shared with me, and more importantly, they've authorized me to share widely, because there are stories that aren't meant to be shared. And so
you share, generally speaking, do you share scientific data? Do you share your kelp data to anyone who is interested in asking?
Absolutely. For us, for Samish DNR, it's always been about how can we be a force multiplier with partners. So if we can bring some resources, and that allows kelp research to do this because we can take this on, we're all about that. So, definitely there are tribes, especially ones with large land bases, that might be a little more proprietary with environmental data from on their reservation. Samish does not have a centralized reservation, so I'm not dealing with that. Where we're working is in Samish traditional territory, where we know there were village sites, summer camps, where Samish people have been since time immemorial. And so it's out there in the world. And so our hope, again, kind of following through on that statement of, if I'm just collecting data and I don't do anything with it, it's just a bunch of Excel files, and why bother? So our goal has always been to turn it into information. And since we're not the hardcore scientists, that means I turn to a Rolodex and find the PhD student who knows all this stuff or whatever, right? Or the agency scientist. And then we want to turn it into action. And so what are we going to do about it?
I think your language is really important. Force multiplier. In a way, I think that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's
For
right. And
sure.
also
Or a
you
catalyst.
said,
Yeah.
you said something else too when Tess was interviewing you. You said something about we kind of look at it with no boundaries here, right? It's Samish area, but I love that because that's what we're trying to sort of say to everyone. There really isn't a, fish don't know a border, and
Right. The
mammals,
orcas don't stop at
Well,
They
yeah,
don't
the shared
stop.
connections, the oceans
Right.
are looking
So
at.
it's a shared connection that we're trying to really highlight as we go around that. Hey, there is no boundary and there is no border. It's a shared connection, and we all should be looking at it, taking
And
care of it.
even if looking back, so Samish speaks Straight Salish. So the three main languages in this area are Straight Salish, Coast Salish, and Lushootseed. So Samish speaks Straight Salish, which is the same language as Songhees and Saanich on Vancouver Island.
Okay.
Did not speak the same language Lushootseed as our neighbors a mile and a half away at Swinomish.
Isn't
Oh,
that
right.
amazing?
So
Wow.
Samish people came, canoe people. They came across, and the neat thing about the San Juans is while we call it Samish traditional territory, the other thing I always end up mentioning is because of the rich natural resources and how easy it is to support your community. This was shared territory. I mean, obviously Lummi from the north and Nooksack. You've got the First Nations coming over. They all came to this area and utilized this area, largely peacefully with the other folks that were around. So indigenous communities, their home is where their history, for hundreds of generations is, and so they get impacted by climate change and increased storms or resource issues. Because it's not just like they can pick up and go somewhere else, because that's someone else's territory if they're going there, right? And so I think you'll find that and I try not to generalize, but I landed a small grant through the U.S. Embassy Moscow like 6 years ago, and we did cultural exchange with the Nenets people, who are traditional reindeer herders who live above the Arctic Circle due north of Moscow, all the way up to the ocean, pretty much. And we sent a delegate there during the spring, and all the pictures of them in matching, like, complete head-to-toe snowmobile suits. I never knew who I was looking at. And then they had a group come here for canoe journey and actually spent several days pulling with our canoe family.
Wow.
And the one thing that we learned that was so interesting was that, those folks, they're keenly aware of the changes in their environment. They're keenly aware that they can no longer bury reindeer meat in the permafrost to preserve it. So they're now running generators to run freezers, and they're keenly aware that that's now exasperating the problem. They're part of it, right?
Wow.
And they're keenly aware that they can't move their herds during the normal traditional timing because the permafrost is melting too soon and it becomes musky, right? And so, Samish is keenly aware of what change in the environment and change in climate is doing to salmon and those traditional foods and resources, and the ability to find traditional use plant material for weaving. And so a lot of what we do is try and make sure that someday a great-grandmother is going to be able to teach her great-granddaughter how to weave a basket in this traditional Samish way, because somewhere those materials are still available. There are amazing things happening, and there's a huge rise in first food efforts with tribes that they're now propagating in community gardens and recognizing the health impacts of the process,
food,
especially on indigenous communities, versus and using that to connect back to song and tradition and story through health and food and language. And so there's huge language preservation efforts that are happening. So, for example, my wife is a speech therapist. She was a linguistics major when we were in our undergrad, and we graduated in '91. She was they were using Coast Salish languages and Southeast Alaska languages as an example, and they were being told that these languages will all be extinct by 2020. They're not. Right? They're not. And in fact, if you are ever up in Whistler and get a chance to go see the Squamish-Lil'wat Culture Center, which was built for the Olympics, the first time I went there, a great-grandfather and his great-granddaughter welcomed us, and it was the granddaughter who welcomed us all in her native language.
That's amazing.
And so what happens there now is after they go to school, in public school with the rest of the kids from Squamish area, they then have 3 hours of cultural and language school at their own tribe. Every child is growing up bilingual.
Good for them.
And this is from a time where a great-grandfather says, I was beaten for speaking my language.
Exactly.
I don't know my language anymore, but my great-granddaughter does.
That's amazing.
So
The resilience
just
of
amazing.
indigenous
Oh yeah,
people
it's
is
incredible.
so inspiring.
And also, they're the leaders. Like, we should be listening to their way of living with the land. They've done a beautiful job, and why?
And the funny thing is, it's not that beautiful symbiosis that that sort of misnomer. It was active management of their landscape. You know, we are involved in prairie bald restoration because of endangered plants and endangered butterflies and tree encroachment. Well, that tree encroachment is happening because families are no longer managing those plots for camas, for food, as a garden. They would manage those by fire. And so on Cypress Island, where we started this work with state DNR, we would go up and we were trying to figure out, okay, here's this remnant prairie bald. What do we want to restore it to? How do we determine how much bigger to make it, you know? And so we started coring trees in a perpendicular axis, and you'd get 70-year-old tree, 70-year-old tree, 70-year-old tree, 70-year-old tree, 140-year-old tree with fire scarring on the bottom.
Wow.
Okay, now we sort of have an idea of where this boundary was.
Wow.
And so we were actually going to do a controlled burn, but that was the year we had the really bad smoke from BC and stuff, so that was not going to be. So we instead went up with WCC crews and did it by chainsaw and moved them off into the woods to become dove, and reestablished those. And we could actually go and say, look, this is the size of this family, this Samish family's camas plot right here. This is where it was before bags of flour replaced that starch source. So.
You know, I noticed on your website, it's so beautiful. Your website's amazing. And the history and the amount of information on it was spectacular. But I love some of your stories and just about how much that the storytelling about how much kelp actually was out here. And there's families of generations of families that can talk about how many more kelp sites were out here. Right?
Thank you so much for
This is just
I'm excited to be a part of it. I'm glad we connected.